Awesome, Chris. Well, I appreciate you coming out. So I'll go ahead and I'll just let you start. I'll just let you explain what it is that you believe and the stance that you're taking. And then we'll kind of I do have a few prepared questions, and we'll kind of just go through it piece by piece. And we'll just work through it. So yeah, just whenever you're ready.
Well, sounds good. Yeah, so pretty much I wanted to kind of just talk about the idea that Paul is really the direct connection to the development of the Gospels, particularly starting with the Gospel of Mark and then going on to Matthew, Luke, and into John, and then also the other epistles. Um, and I would even go into obviously like Acts of the Apostles and First Peter and books like that. So, I don't think that's that controversial. Obviously, Paul is overwhelmingly represented in the New Testament, but as we get into some specific examples, um, I think the idea that the Gospels are historical or eyewitness accounts needs to be significantly questioned if what I'm kind of pulling in is accurate. So my theory is I don't believe the Gospels are eyewitness or historical accounts. They're really, again, starting with Mark in probably the most pure form, they're really Paul's theology put into a narrative form. I guess that's the easiest way I could sum it up before we get into, more specifics. But
Okay. Why Mark specifically?
so I think, I don't know how you feel. I think Mark is usually agreed to be the first gospel written, but also Mark has some very, really strong connections to Paul, to the sense that I feel like it really is just Paul essentially in a narrative form. So I'm not saying that I think Paul wrote the
Right. Yeah.
Gospel of Mark or that he directly had involvement, but whoever wrote it was pulling directly from Paul. And I think that carries through, obviously, with Matthew, Luke. We know Luke is obviously, follows Paul's gospel. And if the book of Acts is written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, then Paul is obviously the prime mover in that. I can get into what I think the purpose of the book of Acts is, kind of getting the early church connected to Paul's movement and things like that. But we can get into that, which I think is a really interesting discussion. It ties in, I don't know how we'll have to just kind of see where it goes, but
Yeah, that's
um,
fine. I was just curious because Mark was Peter's apostle, or excuse me, Peter's disciple. Luke was actually a traveling companion for Paul for quite a while, and Mark was associated with him too, obviously. I think that from my understanding, Luke had more interaction with Paul in terms of his mission trips. So I was just a little curious why.
yes, I know that church tradition, and this comes from Appius, right? And it's from Eusebius talking about that Mark was writing basically as like a secretary to Peter, and Peter was giving his information the best that he could, and Mark wrote it down, but he didn't write it down necessarily in direct order. So I would challenge that significantly. And I can get into internally why I think Mark has no real connection to the historical Peter, or it's definitely connected to Paul's aims and theology and
Well,
gospel. But I can get into why
yeah,
internally, why I
that's
would say that. I don't
yeah.
see any traces of Peter on it, and if there are, then I would really question. It brings up a lot of questions about Peter if this was composed with Peter. Um, but
Oh
I
yeah.
can get into that. That's part of kind of.
Let's kind of start there because what is your criteria for evaluating the historical reliability of any particular text?
The historical. So as I get into kind of the theory, it's how were the gospels constructed, right? What are the sources? What did they use? Did they use, was this basically oral tradition passed on from the earliest disciples to later writers or later followers who wrote this down, kind of like the tradition that you were talking about with
Mhm.
Mark, Mark was the scribe, right, or the secretary in this tradition. He writes down what Peter recalls. And, you go through the tradition. Matthew's supposed to be the tax collector, right? He's there and is recording some of these events of what happened. And then Luke claims that he gathered all this information from other sources and eyewitness accounts and put it all together. And then we have John, who has his separate tradition. But so, I think the basic narrative is that the Gospels were constructed by, um, sources that were there witnessing these events that were happening and they were being recalled to the best of their ability. And then also, obviously, with the construction of the Gospels, you're factoring in, are these divinely inspired texts, right? Which kind of adds another element onto it rather than just regular, eyewitness recall. And so if the claim is, that they have a supernatural element in their construction, then we're not just simply talking about something that was witnessed and then later written down. So,
Well,
you know,
so let's start with that one. So, what do you mean exactly by that? Because I think that if we're going to argue for the veracity of any of these texts, the least productive route is probably to go whether or not they were inspired. Because if we accept that the text is accurate, then we can make the next step and say, well, I can put some faith in this, right?
right,
But
I agree.
if we're starting from no, this is inspired, you run into the same problem that you get with Mormons, and they just try to say, oh no, Joseph Smith had this vision, and we just have to accept him.
Right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of times I feel like when people are suspicious of Paul, they look at Paul sort of the same way that they look at Joseph Smith, which is an outlandish tale. It's a 14-year-old who has a vision of an angel who tells him that the church is in apostasy, that he's the chosen one after almost 2,000 years of, just this rampant heresy. And he goes through this crazy journey where he's only got it takes a couple years for it to come to fruition, but he gets these golden plates and he supposedly interprets them, except that people kind of see the plates, but they don't actually see him interpret them. He looks into a hat and imagines whatever, and he dictates the Book of Mormon. And none of the people that were involved in that, they don't deny that the event happened, but none of them had a strong enough conviction to stay in that church. They all left the faith at some point. They still died saying, yeah, that event happened, but they didn't believe that it was a divine encounter. And a big part of that tradition is the personal conviction. It's the idea of, well, I just read this and it's so divinely inspired. And I read it and I think, well, this is largely the Bible, but altered. So it's like there might be some core in there and there's some interesting stuff, but the difference between something like Joseph Smith and Paul are like, well, a lot of the differences, but one of the differences is that Paul subjected himself to the authority of other people who, as far as we can tell historically, did in fact know Jesus. So he went to them specifically and said, "Hey, this is what I've gotten from it," and they accepted him. And I got a couple of verses I can show you to demonstrate that. But
Sure.
yeah, but just
You're
in
referring to
general,
Galatians.
no. I do have I think I know what you're talking about in Galatians. I have that in here. I have a bunch in here. I wanted to focus more on works that I would say Paul did not write. So specifically the book of Acts and Second Peter, because at the end of the day, we weren't there and we didn't see it and we can't know for sure. However, there's certain methods of evaluating the historicity and the validity of a testimony. And so part of that is, do we have multiple people talking about the same event? And are they pretty much in agreement with it? Now, there's going to be differences. If you make a police report and everybody's saying the exact same thing, that's suspicious because people interpret things a little bit differently. But when it comes to the Gospels in particular, you have a few different perspectives on the same thing, and they do line up, and there's some superficial differences. But at the end of the day, what you see Paul doing is he takes what happened in the event of Jesus, the incarnation, resurrection, crucifixion, all that. He takes that and explains why we should believe him. So when you look at the Gospels are the narrative of what did Jesus do and say, and Paul is bringing our attention to why does this matter? Why should we believe him? And so when you're looking at the event that caused all this, because he was a Pharisee, he was persecuting the Christians, and he had an encounter with who he claimed to be Jesus, and he did a complete 180 after that, and he went straight to the believers, to the early church, and he talked to them, he interacted with them, he prayed with them, and he lived with them for quite some time. And so what ended up happening is that those people who actually knew Jesus accepted Paul as one of their own. And there was a bit of a, period of time where that happened. But I would point out that that does add a certain amount of credibility to the claim that he's not necessarily making this up on his own. Because we weren't on the road to Damascus. We can't definitively prove that. And it would be silly to argue it. But at the same time, we can look at who are the people that had the most credibility and authority. That would be the apostles. And if they unanimously accepted Paul as a fellow apostle, at least as a missionary, then I think that that's a good ground to start along the lines of saying, okay, there's something here. There's something historically reliable behind this. Would you agree with that?
So yeah, there was a lot said, and there's a lot I would.
Okay, we can break it down. I know,
So
Ramble.
um, so I think Galatians is the book that we kind of need to maybe start with,
Galatians 2.
or in answering that. Um, yeah, I mean, well, look, before that, you would agree that Paul's writings come before the Gospels, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So the chain of events is Paul's writings, and
Mhm.
then the
Yeah.
Gospels are created, right?
Now, I would point out that all of those gospels have been confirmed to have been written within the generation that they should have been. So it wasn't like somebody wrote them down afterwards.
So you were saying, so Paul's testimony in Galatians is that he has this encounter, right, on the
Hmm.
road to Damascus with the risen Jesus. Um, but it's really 14 years later that he goes actually to meet with the church. He actually spends a long time by himself, really having visions and all this. Um, or 3 years rather. It's 14 years that he goes with Barnabas. It's 3 years that he spends um, having these visions, and when he goes off basically by himself, right?
Hmm.
So he talks about that he on the road to Damascus that says after 3 years I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him for 15 days. So he visits Cephas is obviously Peter. So he visits Peter and then he visits James, right? So he has a brief contact with them after 3 years. So he's had 3 years to develop this gospel, right? This idea that he goes to them, and then he later talks about that he goes back to them. But what causes him to go back to them is that there are certain people from Jerusalem who are part of the church who are kind of spying in on them, right? About circumcision, and they're trying to convince Paul's followers that, they need to circumcise, they need to probably obey other Torah related Mosaic law requirements. So then he goes back to James and Peter, right? This is Galatians where he goes with Barnabas, and this is where he receives their accommodation to go preach to the Gentiles, while it says that Peter has been called just like him to preach to the Jews, right? So he's gotten what he needs, but you already from that point sense some friction between he refers to them as the so-called pillars, right? And he says that what they say or what they did added nothing to what he does, right? He kind of is talking already like, hey, this is my thing. The only thing I needed from them was to go say, yes, you're preaching to the Gentiles, you and Barnabas, and then basically collecting for the church in Jerusalem. But then shortly, right after that, you have the issue between Peter and Paul, right? About that Peter has a fallout, or Paul has a fallout with Peter because Peter is basically he calls him a hypocrite because the Jerusalem church, they were sent from James, come down, and they're pissed off because Peter is sitting with Gentiles, right, eating.
Hmm.
And for them, that's a violation of the Mosaic law. That's eating with Gentiles, mixing, it's unclean, right? So then Peter
Well,
basically,
well, let's
so
yeah.
long story short, they had this major fallout where Paul then questions that Peter is even following the gospel, right? Or is rejecting the gospel. And not only that, Barnabas takes the side of Peter and the Jerusalem group that comes with James. So you've got Paul now having this fallout friction. So pretty close in Galatians you have, or pretty soon into it, you have this conflict between Peter and Paul and kind of, what is the gospel? There was just a couple verses before that apparently he got their agreement and what they were doing.
Well,
And
let's back up, just pause just a little bit because those are kind of two separate things. So back to the length, we can come back to the Council of Jerusalem, it's fine. But the length of time between the encounter on the road to Damascus and Paul meeting the apostles, I don't know that
three
that's
years,
do I now?
3 years.
Yeah. I don't how is that an important topic though? Because if he went straight to the church, the believers, because he was blinded for several days after that. He interacted with the local church, the believers that were there. The period of
About the
time,
book of Acts.
yeah. So the period of time between that and his basically going out into the world as a Christian, I would argue that that's probably a very important time in everyone's journey of faith because it takes a little while to work out some stuff. Like I told you before I came on, I had kind of a similar experience where, I had this encounter with the Lord, and for several months after that, I didn't completely drop all of my ideology and philosophies that I had before. It took a few months for that to work out, and then after that, I was still bitter and angry, and I was just very a harsh person, and it took probably about a year and a half before I really started to calm down. And then it was even longer after that before I started to apply the theology that I was studying. Now, of course, that incubation period is, if you do it right, that's going to be time that's spent with God. It's going to be time that's spent with other believers. And so whether or not he goes straight to the apostles, I don't really see that as being an issue. The result that I care about is, does he actually do a 180? Does he actually demonstrate repentance and demonstrate a changed heart? And then, most importantly, do the apostles accept him? Because I can look at the history and say, well, Paul's writings are great. I feel like they're inspired, but how do I know I can trust him?
Right, exactly.
But then if I go back to the Gospels and I say, well, can I trust the Gospels? But the people that wrote the Gospels had disciples, and those people had disciples. So there's a large early Christian community that kind of know each other, and there's a certain amount of a buffer there to where, hey, let's say that Mark wrote down a false gospel. That's not what Peter taught. Well, there's a lot of people around that knew Peter, and there's a lot of people around who knew other people that knew Peter. And of course, the longer you go, the more that separation becomes a problem. But when you look in the first 300 years, and you see that there's consistently a unanimous agreement that these four gospels are written by people who are who they claim to be, right? So Luke wasn't an apostle, but he was verified as someone who had historically documented reliably the eyewitness testimonies of people that were there. We might have to do a. I might have to send you out a second link. My Zoom is acting up. I don't know why it's doing that.
Uh,
I paid for it. It better not kick me off. Um,
yeah,
if we get cut off, just hang tight. I'll send you
yeah, it's
back
saying
out.
like 9 minutes and something. I'll just click on another link if.
Okay, yeah, I'll just send it right back out. Um, but yeah, no, that's the gist of the point that I'm making, which is that I don't really think that waiting period is a problem. I would argue that that's probably very important. And then the end result though is the same, that the apostles, although they disagreed as family often does, they ended up being on the same page. They did reconcile with each other. Peter actually speaks very highly of Paul. I'll read out
In
from second.
Paris, Peter.
No, from Second Peter 3:15 through 16. He says, "Bear in mind that the Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul," so he's affirming that he considers Paul a brother, "also wrote to you with the wisdom that God
Right,
gave him. He writes in the same way with all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the other scriptures to their own destruction." So he's verifying that Paul's
right.
writings are inspired
So
by the Holy
whoever
Spirit.
wrote Second Peter is definitely endorsing Paul, right?
Well, Peter wrote Second Peter.
Well,
And we
that's gonna
know,
be a part that we're gonna.
well,
I don't
so
think Peter wrote anything in the
why
New
not?
Testament, but and I'll get into that. And
Well,
that's
well, wait,
part of connecting what Paul's gospel was to seeing does it match. See, this is where it becomes, I think, complicated, and you have to parse out, okay, what did he preach? What was his gospel? Now, obviously, many people say, oh, well, that was the same as what preached. But so the first thing I would bring up is that Paul claims he got his gospel directly from the risen Jesus, right? He
Mhm.
makes that point over and over. Definitely in Galatians, he makes that point really clearly that it did not come from a human source. So, whatever Paul claims to report and whatever his theology is, he makes the point to say none of it came from the original apostles. And this is
Well,
a
let's
absolutely essential
let's
point to
clarify.
understanding the gospels and to
Right.
understand what Mark's doing. And we'll get into that because I'm going to argue that Mark is really undermining the original apostles big time. And this is a theme that you can trace back to Paul. And I can show you a lot of examples where that is.
Let's do that because what specifically are you saying is antithetical to the person of Jesus, his actual teachings? Because when I say that the theology is divinely inspired, you can you can read the Bible and come away with nothing, right? There are atheists who know the Bible very well. Like in and of itself, that is not what necessarily gets through to you. But Jesus says, or excuse me, Luke says in Luke 24 that after the resurrection, Jesus opened their mind to understand the scriptures. So there is a certain amount of when you receive that revelation, things
Right.
just they click in a different way. And
And
that's
I would
again,
trace that back to Paul. This is Paul's
so
theme, is that
well, let me
nobody
just say this
knew
though.
what the gospel, what the actual. So Paul's
Well,
whole
hold on just a
idea
second.
is that, okay, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. So Well, again, I don't think that the strongest position to argue from is that I'm just going to say that this is divinely inspired. The same way it drives me crazy when I try to talk to Mormons and that's all they want
Yeah,
to say is, it's divinely
right,
inspired. It's like
right.
we can't argue with that. So we
No,
can't have
but
a
it's
conversation
an
with that.
important theme. I
It's
think you
important,
have to
but
know that
but it
that's
should
what
be.
Paul is arguing.
But I'm saying it should be an important theme because that's a theme that is repeated throughout scripture. And
Yes.
so just because it's a theme throughout, like you should see consistency between the Bible, between the Gospels and Paul's epistles and the other miscellaneous epistles. Like that's not a sign of Paul undermining anything. That's a sign that people are on the same page, which is what we want.
Right, and that's why it's critical to examine where. So often people, when you open up the New Testament, you go to Matthew first, right? So a lot of people read that first, and then when they get to Paul's letters, any similarities, oh, well, he's getting it from the historical Jesus. He's getting it from, it's been
Sure. Yeah,
passed
yeah.
down from tradition.
But
But
Paul wrote
that's
first, and
not,
yeah, that's
I
what you're
do
saying.
it the
Yeah,
opposite way, right?
yeah, that's what you're
We're
saying. Yeah.
looking at Paul first, right?
Right.
Because there were no gospels. When Paul's writing his letters, Paul's letters are the only thing that's written that we know of that's
So
actually stating Christian theology, right?
let me just, so this is actually, what is your, let me just ask, what is your general exposure been to Christians? Like in Christianity, like not the Bible itself, but like as the Christian interpretation, what has that
Yeah,
been
a lot. I mean,
predominantly?
I speak to Christians all the time. I have
Like
like
Protestant?
conversation, yeah, Protestants, I mean, Roman Catholic, and
So I think one of the things that needs to be emphasized is the value of tradition. And, not everybody likes that, but the reality is that there were a group of people that were running around who were leading this church, and they were the church. And they eventually wrote things down, but for a significant period of time, they didn't. It was oral traditions. It was, this is what Jesus said. And if I get that wrong, somebody else would correct me because there's multiple witnesses to that event. And so before you get into, well, Paul wrote this first, but then Luke wrote his orderly account down the road, that doesn't change the fact that Luke went to other people and wrote down his account of what they said. And so when you have, let's say, let's use Luke as the example. Let's say that Luke writes down his account and he was influenced by Paul, and he's focusing on things that maybe they were outright lies, maybe they weren't, maybe they were just the wrong focus. The problem with that is that there's a lot of people alive who can say that, who can challenge him and say that's not quite right. And the early church is prolific in its writings. It's not afraid to write out against heresies, to convene councils when necessary and possible. So the fact that all of the early church fathers affirm that the Gospels and Paul's writings are in fact historically reliable and are considered as scripture inspired by the Holy Spirit, and which again is like kind of a not necessarily the main point of the conversation, but the fact that they are considered to be reliable and from the people that claim to have wrote them, that's a big deal because you see a lot of issues with writings of that time where people use pseudonyms and they try to just pass these forgeries off as,
yeah, absolutely.
which is the Gnostic problem. But the way that you kind of buffer against that and protect yourself from running into issues as far as like, well, this sounds great, but I want to know that this is actually what Jesus said and that he was a real person. Well, you have to examine the historical evidence, and that comes down to people. Were the people that knew Jesus the ones that were writing these? And all of the tradition says yes. And that tradition, I know it's like a dirty word for some people, but the reality is that tradition is the group of people who knew the disciples, knew the Lord, and agreed on this unanimously as a community. And if somebody dissented from that, there was a conversation, and a lot of that is recorded. And so,
So,
yeah,
okay, so let's use Luke. Let's say
sure.
Luke wants to verify something, right?
Right.
Would you agree that Luke is roughly following the gospel that Paul preached?
Not
Let's just
necessarily.
leave it.
So, in a technical sense, sure, but semantically,
Okay.
I see some issues. And this
Well,
art
I'm
debate
not
is
saying he's absolutely 100% in agreement with everything, Paul, but
well. Pause for just a second because I think the video. Okay, sorry about that. We are back from some technical difficulties, but yeah, we're talking about Luke. So yeah, you can carry on.
yeah, so we were talking about that. So I think I brought up you would be in agreement then that Luke is following Paul's gospel.
So Luke says that he goes to eyewitnesses. And so he wasn't just speaking to Paul. Certainly Paul was a factor in Luke's life, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Luke was talking to multiple sources. He was talking to other people that were there. So, I mean, yeah, like Paul was an influence on him, but that doesn't
Right, but he's
necessarily.
following Paul's got the gospel that Paul
I wouldn't
preaches.
say that though,
Okay,
because
because
because if you're
that then would open up because Paul would say that if you're not following his gospel, you are accursed, right?
he
This is
said that if
from
he said
directly
that
from Galatians.
he's yes, but he's talking about the gospel that was preached by all the disciples.
His gospel, the gospel
He doesn't
he
say his, no, he says the gospel that was preached originally. That is the gospel in First Corinthians, for what I
well,
received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living. Again, you can challenge it. Through though some have fallen asleep, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me. So he's
but
pointing out.
remember, where did he say he got his gospel from? This is a key point. This is
Paul's
essential in understanding Paul.
so
It
Paul's
didn't
whole
come from the other apostles
right,
at all. It came directly from Jesus after he rose.
and then he went to the other apostles and verified that this was in
Yes,
fact
but we don't
correct.
know how much he see. This is the part that's assumed is that he went and, talked about what did Jesus do in real life and what we don't really know what Paul's interest. All we know is that he made sure that he did not receive this from any human source. He got it
Right.
directly from Jesus, even to the point where he makes us know that how did we learn about the night when Jesus broke bread, right? And said, "This is my blood, this is my body." That comes directly from Jesus to Paul. That's how we learn about that.
So okay, I think that's where we would disagree. So when you look at the
Well,
the
he states that directly.
right, but Paul's primary focus, remember in Acts when he talks about, or when Luke talks about, his custom is to go and reason for Christ from the scriptures. So he's reasoning from the Old Testament that this
Right.
is the
That's
Messiah.
where he finds the justification for his
Right.
gospel.
And so when you talk about this, the theology as a revelation, the doctrine as a revelation,
Right.
that is because so the same way that Jesus said in John 5, the scriptures were about me. Moses wrote about me. In John 8, he says, before Abraham was, I am. In Luke 24, he says that the scriptures, he opened their mind to the scriptures. There's a verse about, I have it in here somewhere if you want me to quote it, about how everything written about him in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. So the whole Bible is about Jesus, is what Jesus is saying. And so what Paul is doing is he is receiving that as a revelation because that
Right.
was that was hidden to the Jewish people up until then.
Yes.
They did not understand
Right.
that particular aspect of it. And so this revelation that's coming through, that is something that comes from the Holy Spirit, according to our doctrine and theology. And
Right.
if
That's
we
what Paul's
yeah.
claiming the risen Jesus directly communicated, whether through visions, whether through
And this is a test.
whatever.
And
He also claims to have gone to the third heaven, right? And
this is
received.
this is still attested to by the people that knew Jesus, though. That he's vindicated as being an apostle by those who were, we can all agree
Well,
on, were
but
apostles.
that's where it's fascinating because, like, let's go to Mark.
Sure.
None of the apostles understand at all what Jesus is saying, right? The whole
until,
point of Mark is that none of them know at all what
until
the
afterwards, until after the resurrection.
right, but that's not during his. So just by Mark's own testimony, none of the initial apostles or disciples knew anything about what Jesus was talking about, even to the point where Mark makes this even more of a, I think, kind of a jab at the apostles, is that Jesus says he's tells them directly they're in a special group where the three get this direct, right?
Well,
Uh,
that's not unique to Mark.
well, yeah, no, but it starts in Mark. If Mark is the first gospel, right? Mark's saying that Jesus is pulling aside
But
Peter,
you can't assume
James,
that.
and John and is saying, well, Matthew too, it's fine. It's
But the point is,
shared in all the gospels.
Matthew apparently had written down at least a collection of sayings in Hebrew before he wrote down the
Well,
full.
that's the legend,
And
and
so
that's
there
yeah,
is, and yeah, we don't have to get
we
too
don't
far.
know. We
That's not
don't
a
know. We
like
don't
part of
know.
my argument. I was pointing out that whatever was first doesn't really matter. What matters is whether or not the people who saw and interacted with Jesus recorded that interaction faithfully or not. And if that was through a scribe or something like that, then that's okay. The
Right, but I would argue it does matter if Mark is first. Let's say, let's just go by what like a conservative scholarly Mark's written sometime like 70 AD, and let's say Matthew's 80. It doesn't matter
I
the
don't think that
dates.
that's correct, but I
Well,
think
that's
they're close. They're
generally.
within the 50 years.
So let's just say they're written 10 years apart, right? Or let's just
Right.
say 5 years
Within a
apart. It
few
doesn't
decades.
matter.
Within a few
If
decades, yeah.
Mark's first, that's the first gospel circulating, right?
Okay.
It's pretty clear that Matthew and Luke are using Mark and we're using that as a framework. 90% of Mark is in Matthew and same with Luke. They're
But
using
why is
Mark as a framework.
but
So
if
hold on, but
but if
in
you have
Mark,
people that are saying that are recounting the same experience, there should be a lot of overlap. And if somebody's already done the work, like I'm a writer, I've written a book. When there's a framework that's done for you, it makes it a lot easier. Now you
yeah,
still
but
want
it's
to verify that
copied.
that's
In some
accurate.
cases, the verses are copied, like they're clearly using Mark as a source or
Well,
whatever the first.
I mean, those were verses, quote unquote, that were being recounted in the oral tradition. It's not like they read Mark and said, "Oh, this is good. I'm going to use it." This is what the church agreed
Right.
on.
Well, that's the question. But so the point I'm trying to make is as Jesus pulls aside. So after the parable of the sower, right?
Okay,
He pulls aside them and says, "This is the interpretation of it," right?
sure.
But he makes the point to say that when he speaks in parables, it's not to help people understand better. It's actually to, so they won't come to faith, right? It's so the outside, the Jews will not understand. They won't hear and they won't see. So the whole point of the parables are to confuse the outsiders, but Jesus's insiders are supposedly getting the direct translation of what he's saying, right? But even worse is they don't understand anything he's saying. They completely, first of all, they lack faith, right? Mark shows that Peter and the rest of the apostles continue to lack faith. They continue to lack even understanding to the point where when Jesus has to pull Peter aside and calls him, get behind me, Satan, right? Because you're a stumbling block, right? You basically don't, you're speaking, the words of a man, not the words of God, right? So this whole thing is that Peter and the rest of the apostles are thinking, well, Peter finally identifies him as the Messiah, but that's not really the full picture in Mark, right? The secret is that he's what Paul's idea is he's got to suffer and die, right? He's the suffering servant is This is the secret that he
Well,
has to suffer and die and
that
be
was a
crucified. And he says it flat out to them three times, and they still don't get, where they don't believe or don't trust in what
so
he's
that
doing,
but
right?
that's the point that we were making earlier, that it does take a revelation to understand, because it can be given to you. Jesus, like the prophecies that you're talking about, the Isaiah 54, which you just mentioned, like in Psalm 22, I mean, the Jewish people still don't recognize that as having anything to do with Jesus, even though it's pretty explicit. And so at the time, the point of that is that you, in and of your own ability to comprehend, are incapable of recognizing the divine. And so it has to be revealed to you. And there's a lot of conversation to be had about the way that that happens through the suffering of Christ. But at the same time, you know, the parables being sort of it's not a riddle that you have to figure out. It's the same type of language that's been used throughout the Old Testament. So you look at the book of Exodus, for example. The book of Exodus, when you put it in the context of the cross, it makes perfect sense. But when you just look at it as a Sunday school story, that hey, this crazy stuff happened, and all these wild, nightmarish plagues fell on this unsuspecting people, and God just obliterated all these poor innocent civilians, and then let his people out, and it's like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense until you understand that that is a tangible manifestation of our condition without God, because the idolatry and the culture of that time was oppressive and held the God's people in bondage, right? And so the series of plagues speak directly to the ministry of Christ, the way that God leads them out of the bondage of sin, even the way that he has them leave in haste after the Passover, because you're not supposed to dwell where God has freed you from. That's not the point of it. He's taking them out to become a holy people for him. And so I know this is getting a little bit away from the main point of it, but the idea of this is that that's always how God has spoken to us. It's not to confuse us, but it's that you have to recognize that your understanding is dependent on him.
But what does Jesus say the purpose of the parables are?
So it's to fulfill the prophecy that though they have ears, they do not hear, I believe.
Right.
I forget the exact verse.
So
Yeah.
that they won't turn and come to faith, right?
Right.
Okay, so goes back, this
But
theme,
but
I would argue,
But
goes
John
directly back to
3:19,
Paul.
he explains why that is, though. In John 3:19, it's not due to ignorance or lack of ability to understand. People reject the light because they love the darkness, for their actions are evil.
They're blinded, right? Paul explains
They're
that
blinded because they
when
love the
Moses
darkness.
gave the Ten Commandments and came down and gave not the commandments from Mount Sinai, that the Jews, that at that point they're since they've read the scriptures, they're hardened, their hearts are hardened, and they can't see and understand their own scriptures. This is the whole idea, and it gets back to the point that you talked about, that the Jews do not understand, according to Paul, their own scriptures. They don't understand that these were
But
speaking about the Christ that was
that's
to come, right? And that's the whole theme in Mark, is that
that's
they
not you.
don't understand.
That's not unique to the Jewish people, though, because Christians still do the same thing with the Bible. They still beat each other over the head with verses that are meant to soften us to one another, right? People still abuse it to excuse sinful, unjust behavior, to mistreat each other. That's not a commentary on the nature of the scriptures. It's a commentary on the way that people abuse them when we take it as the letter of the law. This is the thing that I have, but we don't have the heart behind it. We don't actually have the legitimate relationship and love for God, which is the point of all this. And Jesus makes that clear when he talks about how, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her just in his heart. So he's pointing out that, like, look, it's not about just not doing the action. It's about becoming somebody different. It's about being pure, being purged of all this, of all the sin and the things that keep you enslaved to the darkness of this world. And so when you look at Paul, he's pointing to why Jesus has the authority to say that, right? And because it's the same thing that the Jewish people that were listening thought, like, well, who are you to say these things, right? How are you to give us a new law? And That's the whole point of the Gospels is that Jesus is the lawgiver,
Right.
original
Well,
lawgiver. And Paul's
but
reasoning that
Paul
from
is
the Old
doing
Testament.
something radical. He's saying that these scriptures to the point where First Peter says that, you know, the prophets didn't even really know what they were actually writing about. They were searching
They did.
all the way to the point where the angels didn't know and were trying to find out what these scriptures were about. So this is
Well,
again a
the
Pauline
devil
theme. It's
in the
that
wrote
the
in the wrote him.
scriptures are all pointing to Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Like Isaiah, the suffering servant, that's the major overwhelming theme that Jesus has to suffer and die and be crucified, right? And these were seen in the scriptures, but nobody saw them, right? And this
Mhm.
is what my point is. Mark is picking up this theme, which is absolutely Paul's gospel, that which is to say that the original disciples were clueless as to this theme, right? Now, Jesus says it though flat out three times that he has to suffer, die, be crucified, and will rise in 3 days. They still don't really listen to what he's saying. But furthermore, Mark makes the point where certain Jews and then Gentiles, more importantly, do recognize through faith, right? And this is another major theme. Obviously, Paul is known for faith, right? That's
Right.
the theme of faith alone or faith. And this is Mark's major theme is that those like the apostles lack faith, right? That's why. And then on the other hand, certain individuals show faith. That's why they're healed, right? That's why the demon is driven out. But what does Jesus tell them, especially the Jews? He tells them, don't tell anybody, right? He tells them in Mark, definitely don't tell anybody. Because this is again the this
He told a specific person that.
he told several people
Sure.
not to tell. But then when he crosses over the Sea of Galilee, it's like going over to a Gentile area. And then
Yeah.
like when they drive out the pigs, right? Where they drive out the demons and they put them into the pigs. When he does that, he doesn't tell them not to tell anybody. He actually says, go. And this is again another one
Well,
of
there's
Paul's
reasons for
themes,
that though.
spreading the gospel to the Gentiles. So this
There's
is what
reasons.
I'm trying to do is show you connections, and I can show you some specific connections
Well,
that'll kind of make this a little bit maybe more.
yeah, we can do specifics, but let me also
Yeah,
just comment on the Legion of Demons. When you look at, Jesus makes it very clear that he's sent first to the house to the lost sheep of Israel. He's first
right,
to go to the Jews,
right.
and then
Which is a Paul's theme as well, that
right,
it goes
which is
first
what
to the
Paul did, yeah,
Jews.
for sure. Um, I don't see how a an apostle or an author putting an emphasis on a certain aspect of Jesus's ministry being a problem, because like I said, I think you said it actually that they were writing to different audiences. And so if the foundations, if the fundamental claims of the gospel are different, that would be an issue, obviously. But if one person is writing, so Matthew is writing specifically to a Hebrew audience that is going to understand, there's a presupposition that they understand, say, the Old Testament, right? Versus who was it? I think Luke and John wrote to the Gentiles, or maybe it was Mark.
Yeah, I think Mark is
Mark,
because Mark
sure.
explains things in a sense that you like he expects his audience doesn't know what the Pharisees do and what
Right.
the tradition.
We
Like he
but that's
explains that they
valid.
have these custom of washing their hands, right? And
Sure.
cleaning the inside of their cups and those kind of he
Well, that's
makes
pretty
like an
universal.
explanation that if you would have been in that culture, you wouldn't require this explanation, right? But I think he's writing to a Gentile audience primarily, or at least
But that
Jews who are living in like a Galilean type, Gentile community,
sure.
which is many of
Yeah.
what Paul's communities were, a mixing of Jews and Gentiles, but had a very Roman.
That was the world at the time. Yeah. Well, I still don't see how that's a problem, but yeah, let's go into the specific examples. Let's do that.
Right. So like this will just be one that'll kind of give you an idea of what I'm kind of looking at. So, well, this is an easy one that so if you go to um like First Corinthians 11:23, right? This is famous passage where Paul um is talking about what he received as far as the night before Jesus was crucified, right? He gave his,
So,
he
okay,
said, "This is my body, this is
sure.
my cup, right? This is my blood." And he does the whole, what's later repeated in Mark, Matthew, Luke. I would argue that comes directly from Paul. Now, this is an example where you could easily make an argument. Well, it may have first been said in Paul's writings, right? But this was also a tradition that the, you know, apostles knew, and so this could have been something that was also that found its way into Mark through that tradition and not directly from Paul, right?
Well, the focal
That
point.
could be a legitimate argument in that
So the
case.
focal point of the Gospels is the crucifixion and resurrection. So there should be some agreement throughout the early church community on that, especially since it wasn't until that happened that the revelation of the scriptures came about. And I mean we can look at that in the road to Emmaus.
So, right. So
Yeah.
like did you look at First Corinthians 11:23?
Yeah, where to go?
So the key part, though, to see in that is that Paul makes it clear that he received this from the risen Jesus. He did not get it from the apostles. This was not a tradition passed on to him from the apostles.
No,
Now,
but my
again,
so okay, so I see what you're saying, but my point is that whether or not, however Paul came about this information, when he went to the apostles, they vindicated him.
right, they could have, and that's
Well, they
that's what
did.
I'm saying. So in this case, that's one that you could say, okay, well, even if he did get it directly from Jesus, the other apostles got it because they were there with Jesus the night before he was crucified, and that's how they got it, and that's how it found its way into Mark, right? That's
If if
fine.
if
That could
the
be
if the
the only
gospels,
reason I'm bringing it up is to establish kind of what I'm going at, because
sure,
my
okay.
point's going to be that all of this is coming from Paul and not some tradition from the
But uh, but
apostles.
but
But I'm going to
fundamentally,
give you examples that are going
sure,
to be much harder to say they came from the apostles, if that makes sense. And I'll
sure.
give you
But again, fundamentally, we do have to recognize that if the apostles were there and were at the Last Supper, then they know what happened. And so if Paul said something different, they would correct him. And also, too, any work that comes from them should consistently point to the same event. And if Paul comes alongside them and agrees with them, that's a pretty strong argument for Paul. But the fact that he also subjected himself to their authority is another big key point there. If Paul is trying to make up his own gospel, trying to create his own religion, he wouldn't base his authority so much around the fact that he is in communion with these people.
well, I don't think he does base any of his authority that he's in communion with them. He makes the point that they are not of any importance to him, which again I'm going to argue is a part of Mark again. I'll make that
Okay.
case that Mark is following that same, that he's not saying he gets any authority from them. He's saying that the only thing he got from them was their right hand of fellowship at the time
Well, that's what
when
I'm
it
that's what I'm
preached to
I'm
the
not saying that.
Gentiles.
Yeah.
but then we have a clash immediately after that between Peter and Paul. So
Well, disagreements
obviously
are
they
normal
didn't
though.
speak about that part right there. And then we'll go on and kind
Sure.
of show. But so that's one. So that comes directly from the risen Jesus to Paul and then finds its way into Mark, Matthew. So like I said, that's one that you can say, oh, well, that's an easy one to explain. That, came directly from the apostles. But let me bring up one that maybe will give you a little bit more. Um, So I won't go too controversial yet. So,
No, I'll
in,
go for it, man. That's cool. I'm here for
so
it.
I'll build it
You
kind
can,
of.
yeah, yeah, build up to it. That'll be more fun.
So in Mark, Jesus, there's kind of a. We were talking about the verse when they encounter. Well, let's go. It's in Mark 7:19. Okay, if you go to Mark 7:19. It's the verse where it's said at the end that, and he declared all foods clean, right?
Okay.
Okay, and that's a very controversial, like people go back and forth. Jesus clearly wasn't declaring, non-kosher foods clean or you know, um, he wasn't going against the Mosaic law about food dietary laws, and that goes back and forth. I think he is, but with a, kind of with a caveat, but it's the same caveat that Paul has. So if you go to First Corinthians 10:23 and Romans 14:14, the overall idea from Paul is that all foods are available to eat, right? If you're a follower of Christ, you can eat all foods. All foods are permissible. But he has this caveat that if you're eating in front of, like, if you're with another Jewish follower and it offends him that you're eating pork, right, or whatever, then you're probably better to not do that, right? You're
Right.
like, you have to kind of have regard and respect for the people you're with. You're not offending them. But he makes the point that if you are invited to eat at somebody's house, you eat what they serve, right? You're not, so you're not under this. You're not under the Mosaic law. And Paul's clear that he no longer is under the Mosaic law. He's under the law of Christ. That's how right? So again, I would argue Mark is taking Paul's lead with that when he has Jesus, because he doesn't have Jesus directly saying it. It's kind of like an aside from Mark, right? And he declared all foods clean. Typically, it's put in like parentheses. If you go to like Mark 7:19, it'll usually, when it's translated, it'll kind of have that at the end, which is kind of like, we're not putting this directly in the mouth of Jesus because, and I'll make an argument that I think obviously Mark is not going to have Jesus, first of all, dealing with an issue that Paul dealt with much later, right? This was not an
Well,
issue that Jesus would have been dealing with.
well,
Jesus
well,
was
let's start. Well, yeah, that was a
This
lot.
is something that Paul's dealing with within his community of Jews and Gentiles, and where does the law, how much does the law impact a follower of Jesus? And
Right.
so we don't need to
So,
get into all that. I'm
well,
just
I'll
making the
address,
point.
yeah, I'll address that point though.
Okay,
So, and that was essentially the topic of the Council of Jerusalem. Are we going to require that
right.
these Gentiles be
Yes.
circumcised in order to be Christians? And that was sort of where Paul made his first mark and gained the respect of the apostles. Um, as he stood up, he basically made a case for no, like why would we put that burden on them? One, we haven't been able to uphold it, and
Right.
two, that's not the point of what we're preaching. The point of it is not because you're not saved through the works of the law, and so that's a loaded statement, and we'll break it down a little bit.
So
First,
But
Yeah,
right, so I'm not even going to Acts right now. Acts is. I'll explain
I'm
what
just
I
using
think
that. Yeah,
Acts is.
I'm just
Just
using that to
sticking with
illustrate that that
Paul's
is.
letter because
Yeah,
I think when
Paul.
you
Well,
bring
hold on.
in Acts, it confuses. Acts isn't written by Paul, right? So this
Well,
is
neither is
something
Mark.
later that's being. I'm not saying
So,
it's not historical or there's not, but
right. I'm
when
trying to
James
I'm trying to
rules
set.
that Gentiles only have to, eat food that doesn't have blood and,
So
he just has
that
some basic requirements for the Gentiles. I think that's a later.
it's not. It
All
sets up
I'm
what I'm.
trying to make
It
is,
sets up response to your
okay,
point.
but
Yeah.
let me just ask
Well,
you this. Do you disagree that Paul is saying all food is available to eat for a follower of Christ?
I'm trying to explain.
Okay.
So basically, what we got to understand here is, and a lot of, especially Protestants misunderstand this. There's a tendency to confuse the Old Covenant with the Old Testament, and it's not the same thing. So when we talk about, because Jesus even said, "I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." And so we have to think about that. And I didn't even know this until quite some time through my researching. But we have to understand, is it okay to murder each other now? Like, are we still under that law or no? And obviously, like that's not like to say that we are now free to murder each other is not consistent with the teachings of Christ. And what we need to like articulate is that there's three types of laws. There's the civil, the ceremonial, and the moral law. So we are still under the moral law. So that would be the Ten Commandments: don't murder, no adultery, no idolatry, honor your father and mother, don't covet, stuff like that. The civil laws applied specifically to the nation of Israel. Ceremonial laws were what you had to follow in order to come into the temple. So if you were, there's a lot of things that can make you ceremonially unclean, but there's a big difference between being ceremonially unclean and committing the type of sin as like say murdering somebody. So the dietary regulations and the works that make you ceremonially clean, I can't say it for some reason. So things like circumcision, which was addressed in the Council of Jerusalem, the dietary restrictions, those sorts of things, those that is what Christ fulfilled. We don't need to offer a sacrifice in the temple anymore because he has been the perfect sacrifice for us. So when we look at, well, does that mean that if I walk near a dead body, I can't pray? Like that's the kind of thing that they're addressing because in the old covenant, you couldn't go into the temple if you came in contact with a dead body. You had to go through a purification process or certain amount of waiting time. So when we talk about the clean and unclean animals, and we realize that, well, if what Jesus is saying is true, he fulfilled the law. That doesn't mean that we're allowed to do whatever we want. Sin is still sin, but the regulations that allow us to come into worship with him, that is no longer in effect because he has fulfilled that. And that's partially symbolized by the rending of the veil of the Holy of Holies. And so when Paul says, "Look, you know, this isn't really the issue anymore. The issue is who is God and how do we relate to him?" And if the old way of doing things was based off of these works, that's not repentance, that's not, obedience, that's works in a religious ceremonial sense. Those are not things that take us into the temple anymore because we have the Holy Spirit living in us because Christ has bridged that gap for us. And so the food thing is interesting too because that also originally comes from Peter. And so those two things together, the
Are you
circumcision, the
referring to
food, yeah,
Acts?
yeah. So
Yeah,
Peter,
and what I think
I've
that is a direct addressing of the fallout between Peter and Paul that happened in Galatians. I think Luke or whoever wrote Acts is addressing that exact situation. And I think that's restoring, I'll get into that. That's restoring
no, no,
Peter
are you
back
saying
into the
what do you
fold.
yeah, what do you mean by that? Because are you saying that Luke made it up so that Paul and Peter get
Yeah,
along?
well, it's directly addressing the issue that Peter and Paul had over eating with Gentiles, because the whole issue with Peter in Acts is that he sees, right, this image and he sees all these unclean animals and it says, get up and eat, right? Kill,
Mhm.
get up and eat. But it's really not eating unkosher food. It's uh, preaching to Gentiles, right? It's interacting with non-Jews. And that's the issue that Peter has to overcome, right? And he finally overcomes it. He goes to meet to the centurion's house, and the whole fallout is from that. But that's the exact issue that Peter and Paul had an issue over. So I think that's
Sure.
Luke restoring this. Luke's
Well,
that for me, the whole purpose of Acts is to restore the original apostles, the Jerusalem church, and graft that back into Paul's movement, which is the
well, what
real
is that? But that's
Christianity.
based off of the presupposition that Paul is the one creating Christianity, because Luke's
Yes,
account is to give a historical record of what happened. So that's not
right.
the same.
But so if what I'm saying is holds water, then the gospel, Paul's got it. They're all related directly to Paul's teachings, right?
Well,
So
they're all interconnected with each other because they're all centered around the same person, and they
that's
were
the
all alive
question,
at the
and
same
that's what I'm
time,
trying
interacting with each
to
other.
bring out is that I don't think the Peters and the Jameses of the world had really any say in the New Testament. I think it's
Well, they wrote part of
all
it, so
theology.
I
And
think they
that's
had some
what
say.
I'm trying to kind of show. So with that example, this is Paul, because again, and what I think is going on in that verse, it's so I would argue that Paul's not following any of the Torah he's again not under the Mosaic law, right? But he is under
Ceremonial
the
law,
law of
ceremonial,
Christ. And that
ceremonial.
doesn't mean that anything goes. He makes that point clear.
Right.
Actually, you do have to uphold a higher standard, right? And I think that's what Matthew is actually gripping onto, that it's not following the law of Moses doesn't mean you just freelance and do what you want. Absolutely not. It's actually a higher calling, right? To
Hmm.
follow Christ is actually a higher, it's like you said, like, it's no longer is just killing or murdering somebody physically murder. It's
About
actually
being like God,
your
yeah.
brother with hatred in your heart, right? No
Yeah.
longer is adultery just sleeping with another woman. It's looking at a woman now with, right? So
But
these are
I'm not seeing how the consistency in these different narratives is a problem though.
so so that's just two, and I'm showing you the influence of Paul on it. That's what my
So,
point is.
but the idea that Paul is the one from whom all of these gospels are derived, I haven't seen a solid argument for that. Just that there is a relationship and that these
Right.
themes are connected, which they should be if they're about the same person and the same doctrine.
Right, right. So the issue is going to be how were the gospel, this will get into how were they constructed? Were they actually historical retellings, or are they basically taking Paul's themes and ideas and reconstructing them into narratives, right? So
Okay.
like, here, let me pick out one that's a little less um so here's a good one that kind of so Paul, one of his major themes is that he was the least of the apostles, right?
Doesn't sound like somebody starting his own religion.
Right. Well, this is the whole reversal idea. So Paul's whole idea is that he was the last to see the risen Jesus, right? He's the least likely because he persecuted the followers of Jesus. He's the least, right? He's the last. So you would think of that
Inconsistently, yeah.
as, oh, well, that's a purely negative thing. Well, it's kind of a turning on its head kind of thing. As we know in the Gospels, and this again is a theme from Paul, the last is actually the what? The first, right?
That's not that. So again, though, just because
So
that theme, just because,
those who are considered to be the
yeah.
least,
But
right?
again, if that is actually quoting Jesus, then he is before Paul. So just because Paul is reiterating that does not mean anything.
Yeah, but we don't know that Jesus. This my
That's
point
why
is that
that's
this
that's
could have
why the tradition matters because the collection of people who were there who actually saw him were able to say if Paul was telling the truth or not. And if they agreed with him and that his teaching is consistent with what Jesus taught, then that is evidence that he is in fact receiving this divinely from the Lord. So if the apostles were disagreeing with, and I don't mean over the things that like petty things, right? There's
right.
obviously always going to be differences in opinion when it comes to the interpretation of doctrine or the application of theology. And you see that all the time, and it's going to happen. And I think to some extent that's okay. The issue is when it gets down to major things in terms of like who is Jesus, who is God, what do I have to do to be saved? Like those are the big issues. And when you see that Peter, for example, and he travels with multiple apostles, they give him the right hand of fellowship, like you quoted earlier. They entrust him with the money of the church as well to move the money around between these different churches. That's not a relationship of someone who is trying to undermine the apostles and create his own religion. That is a partnership.
Well, he's told to bring back money to the Jerusalem church, which to the followers in Jerusalem who were, theoretically poor and
They were poor.
but going back to the first being the last and the last being the first, right? If you go
Sure.
to like Ephesians 3.8, First Corinthians 50, let's look at Ephesians 3.8.
Sure. I mean, let me find the verse. Paul was commissioned to go to the Gentiles. And
So,
that's
although I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to me to bring to the Gentiles the news of the boundless riches of Christ. So, that's one example. He also talks about during the verse about, when Jesus appeared, he makes the point that he was the least and, really not even worthy of. But again, you
but that
got to
is the gospel.
understand Paul, for Paul being the least is going to lead to being the first in the kingdom. And this is the theme that gets picked up by Jesus. And that because in the
Jesus
Gospels,
was Jesus was first though, so it would have been picked up by
well, the
Paul.
followers. So Jesus tells the followers in the Gospels, right, in Mark, starting, he tells them, so we have this situation where the apostles are arguing, two of them are arguing
Yeah,
over
yeah, yeah,
who's
yeah.
going to sit at the right hand, right?
Mhm.
And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking, right? Because they, again, are clueless that drinking from his cup means they're going to go to the,
They're
die,
gonna
right?
suffer, yeah.
Basically, they're going to
Which
suffer
they
and die.
which they
That's
do.
what being a true apostle is. You suffer and die, right?
Mhm.
So being the least, you suffer and die. This is also Paul's theme. He suffered numerous hardships. He was
And so
stoned.
that's
He was
and
lashed.
that's so
He
that's a good
was
point though. Like why would someone who's generating a false doctrine to serve their own ends, why would they be willing to suffer what he did? Because again, back to the Joseph Smith example, he didn't do any of that. He tried to for president. He took on however many wives. He married a bunch of teenagers. He did exactly what you would expect for someone to do if he was trying to create power for himself.
right.
Paul,
Well,
on the
when
other
you
hand,
say a
lived on the road.
false,
Yeah.
so that's so I don't know that I'm not arguing that he may very well have believed it.
Okay.
I mean, that's getting into a whole new like what he may have believed that he was. In fact, I think there's a good argument to say that Paul truly believed that, he would
Well,
be
well,
redeemed
let's
and Jesus would return and he would be given a new heavenly body and the whole thing that Paul talks about.
let's
So,
pause on that for a second though, because again, Paul's the basis of Paul's story is that he was completely opposed to the Christian doctrine, that he was the Pharisee of Pharisees, that he was well educated, well respected, of sound mind, and that he did a complete 180 after an encounter with Jesus. And I think that that speaks to an incredible power that is echoed in the fact that Christianity turned the world upside down and it forever altered the course of history. And its presupposition is humility and peace and lowliness and things that are contrary to human nature. And so, for that message
right.
to reach people who are prideful and actively murdering its supporters and to turn them on their head like that, that says something.
So, yeah, so first of all, we don't know so the initial apostles, we don't know, they may have claimed to have seen the risen Jesus, but again, there's no evidence that they shared any of Paul's theology. Like they
They,
didn't,
what do you
there's
mean?
no evidence that they shared any understanding of the gospel. And that's clearly, even Mark and the gospels show that that is so.
They
None of the
not
Christian
before the
theology is
resurrection.
that none of them understood any of this until
Before the
Jesus appeared to them, right?
before it was revealed to them. They ended up understanding them, and that was
Right.
the rest of the New Testament is the explanation for,
So they
hey,
were all in the same boat as Paul, essentially. And this again goes back to Paul being that none of this is Paul's idea that none of them have really any authority or anything that's more important over Paul because none of them really understood the
I
if you're
don't I
projecting
don't see that
onto
connection. I don't see that because
none of them really understood anything about what Jesus really was here to
he
do or fulfill until
he
after
right, but
fact.
but
And
he
I'm
was
not
even
even
later.
thinking Paul even says that they understood that. See that
I don't is there I don't know if there's a if you have a verse that's fine, we can look at it, but I'm not aware of a verse where Paul is criticizing them for not understanding, but the point of it is that
well
it was
Mark
revealed
does.
later, but Paul didn't write Mark. So the point of that is that they understood afterwards, and Paul makes it clear that he is considered the least of the apostles because he was the one that came on
Right,
last.
which
He didn't walk with Jesus physically. He had he claimed to have an interaction with him, but just because Mark wrote something that was similar to what Paul said, again, if they're talking about the same person, it should be pretty similar. If it's talking about the same event.
right. So then the connection would have to be, is it more likely, so in this connection, is it more likely that Jesus preached the first being the last and then Paul adopted this view to himself? It's possible. Like but the none of the original apostles did that. They all, because the whole point is that, from Paul's point of view, is that the apostles consider themselves the pillars, right? They're the main,
I think Paul affirms that they're the pillars.
right? They're so they
Well,
don't look at themselves as the least if they were adopting, if this supposedly came
well,
from the
so
historical Jesus, then they
so
did
you,
a bad job of applying it to themselves, just like in the
I
gospel, right?
I would disagree with that. So when you look at like what are the pillars? This is the foundation upon which everything else rests, right?
Right. So James,
So look at my
John, and
right.
Peter.
My entire argument has been that the traditions that were established by these people are is what gives validity to the text, right? Like I'm not sitting here saying, well, I had a divine revelation. I'm looking at the fact that the 12 apostles physically witnessed the death and resurrection of Jesus, or at least believed that they did. And out of that, they developed a community. They weren't the only ones either. They were just the main ones. So when you reference back and say, well, how can I know that this is true? I can look back at the people that knew Jesus, they agreed with each other, and they taught the same message. I would disagree that they taught a different gospel doctrine, unless you have a specific example. But they are the pillars of that because the foundation of the entire church rests on their testimony. That's the testimony that went out because Jesus didn't write it down himself. And so to say that they're not taking a humble position, I think that that would be incorrect because they all were willing to suffer, die horrible deaths, and to basically make themselves to subject the rest of their lives to the servitude of Christ. And so that is lowly, that is humble, that is making yourself the least because they gave up everything to follow God,
Right, but that's based on church tradition, right?
which is
Like,
historically valid.
like we don't really know what happened to Peter. We don't really even know what happened to Paul. Church tradition tries to put them in Rome together, that they, died and were
Well, we
martyred
so
together, but we don't really know any of that. All we
So
have is
there's so
written,
right. There's not a Roman official edict saying Peter, the disciple of Jesus, is killed on this day. There's not that. However, when you consider the amount of historical reliability that the Bible, especially the eyewitness testimonies in general, have supporting it, and you say, well, like you just said, what's most likely? Are the people that have been proven to be reliable in these things lying about Peter dying? Or is it more likely that Peter actually died, considering that that was common at the time? We do know that historically that Christians were killed in horrific ways. So that's not a challenging idea just because we don't have record of when Peter died. Like it's okay to say like this is a likely outcome. You understand what I'm saying?
right? We just don't know. We don't know anything really apart from church tradition. So I'll give you another one.
Which is
So
historically verifiable.
So when Jesus sums up, right, the law, he says that really the law is summed up by saying that,
Love your neighbor, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your
right,
neighbor as yourself. Yep.
right. So where does the love thy neighbor come from? Where is the original source, do you think, for that?
From the same one that gave the law in Deuteronomy. That's the point of Jesus' ministry, that he is God.
Okay, but who is the source that I keep saying is directly feeding into Mark? And if we
So,
go to
but again,
Galatians 5:14 and Romans 13:8, sure enough, Paul brings that up as being
so here's a thought. So your Paul's letters were written to the churches to address doctrinal issues, right? But the gospel that was preached to them was already established. Christianity was already spreading before Paul came along. So if he came along and said something totally different, that would have created friction, right? So I would argue, how do you know that any of this isn't coming from the disciples? Because yes, he said that he received it from divine revelation, but
right.
that doesn't mean that he didn't have an instruction period. Like he had time by himself with the Lord, yes, but he also walked with the other apostles.
So is
I
he
think
lying then that it didn't all come from?
you can
You can't
I
see
get this is this
if
is
you're
what I
going
was
to
trying to say
take
earlier.
Paul and say he's trustworthy, then we can't just say we want to make some parts also come
I'm
from
not
the
saying that. No, no.
disciple.
I'm not saying that. I'm going back to what I said earlier that just because you have, I'm trying to think of a good example. Just because you have something in front of you doesn't mean that you understand it, right? Like I'm sure we've all had an experience where we weren't ready for something and it was an opportunity or some kind of knowledge, right? And once we're made ready for that thing though, we're able to handle it. We're able to digest it. We're able to apply it. Paul receiving divine revelation does not mean that he didn't also learn what Jesus spoke. It does mean that the in the same way that apostle can come to us today and say this is exactly what Jesus said, and we might not understand it, right? They can come to Paul and say the same thing, and he might not understand it. But because of the fact that he actually was chosen and set apart by the Holy Spirit in Acts, and I can refer to that too, for service for the ministry of the gospel, he receives that divine revelation. So just because he understands something as being from God directly doesn't mean that the words were not from a person. So if if I tell you one of Jesus' parables and you don't understand it, but then you go home and say, you know what, I'm curious. Let me see what happens, and I pray about it. And you pray to God for understanding, and He gives it to you. Well, you receive that from God, right? But I said it first, technically, in this, scenario. You understand what I'm saying, right? So to
Right.
say that Paul, just because his letter is penned first, does not mean that the apostles were not preaching already.
And I get the argument. So again, could the apostles have said, "Hey, you know that the Jesus said when we were with him to love thy neighbor, right? Love God with all your heart and love thy neighbor like thyself or whatever."
Mhm.
Could they have said that? Yes. But again, my argument is all of these can be found in Paul. Every major theme that I'm pointing to in Mark
And my
can be
point is
found
that
in
they
Paul.
should be found in Paul if
So
he
let's,
actually, in fact, is in agreement with the
but
apostles.
I'm going to get to some that are from a different context, and
Sure.
I'll give you a. That's where it gets to be where you're like, hmm.
Well, yeah, let's go for it.
And I'll show you that. But
Yeah.
let's do the reverse. Love thy enemy. Love the where does that's a big point in the Gospels, right? You've heard it say not only to love your neighbor, but you're also to love your enemy. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount, right? But where does that theme come from again? Well,
Again,
Paul goes into
just because
detail in
Paul talks about it
Romans.
doesn't mean that it comes from him.
Again,
That's I don't think we're going to agree on that point. So maybe we can just move
right.
on, because
So,
I
okay,
think
but
we're
I'm
going to go
just
back in
showing
circles on
you.
it.
So
Yeah.
both are covered by Paul, right?
You could argue that it came from Jesus though. So that's why I'm saying, like,
Right,
we're going
right,
to go in
right.
circles on
You
that one.
can.
But yeah, go ahead and give
Okay.
me one of the
So
other.
here's another.
Yeah.
Here's one that's a little bit more. Okay, so we know that. Let me find it so I can find the.
Let me ask you a question while you're looking that up real quick.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious, if you were, like, hypothetically, obviously, and this is for a purpose, is to help the flow of the conversation.
Right.
If you were able to ask Paul himself a question to determine whether or not he was an apostle, what would be the most important question for you to have answered?
To see whether he was an apostle.
To see whether he was an apostle, and if his what he wrote is reliable and not just from him.
Um. So I think you would have to establish that he really is receiving this divine revelation. I mean, that really all comes down to that.
Sure. And okay,
And if
and
he's
so
not, then he is not an apostle.
okay, so okay.
That would directly disconnect him from any,
So can you clarify that?
like that would cut off, that would be like cutting the umbilical cord to
So if
apostleship because his whole thing, as he states, is directly, it lives or dies on that he is getting divine revelation from the risen Jesus.
so how would he prove that to you?
Well, I don't know. But if you said if I were to ask him, I mean,
No,
I
no,
know
no, no.
I
Yeah,
know I'd have to
it's not a trick
question
question.
him
Yeah.
and talk with him, and he'd probably
But what I'm saying though is, well, I want to establish, like, what are the real objections, because I know that a lot of times we have a lot of peripheral things that bother us, but I
right.
also, what I've learned is that those things oftentimes don't reveal themselves until you take a step of faith. Now, that doesn't mean blind faith, obviously, but I'm curious, what are the, like, the big picture things I think that being able to verify whether or not you have divine revelation is a pretty big deal, but also that gets into the weeds pretty quickly as far as, well, what would be the method to prove that? Because if it's I talk to him and I just feel like he's from God, well, you can be tricked with that. Well, I can be tricked from that. We all can. We're all led astray by charismatic people at some point or another. So I think that the way that the gospels are set up is in such a way that God is able to he allows us the opportunity to ask questions and to search and to look and to obviously receive personal revelation from him. But at the same time, this is based upon eyewitness testimonies. The all of this is based on eyewitness testimonies and what those people pass down to their disciples and so on and so forth. That's the apostolic tradition.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, if somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, you know that guy that they've been talking about? Like they killed him. You know that part, but he came back to life." Well, why should I believe you, right? And one of the things that Paul does is he explains from the Old Testament that they had how Jesus fits the bill, why we should listen to him, and what the implications are for us. And so when you talk about it being a divine revelation, what better way to verify whether or not this was a divine revelation than to go to the people who encountered this man and witnessed this miraculous event? And if they attest to the fact that Paul, in fact, is on the same page as they are and that they consider him a brother and a fellow believer, I think that makes a pretty strong case.
So you're saying you could verify it by
I'm saying
they
that
are upholding, like
there
a
could
Peter is upholding the same gospel that Paul is?
and that you could always find a reason to doubt whether something was from God or not. And the Bible's full of stories like that where people ignore very obvious, direct, explicit commands from the sky type of deal. So I mean, there's always the opportunity. So God coming down, an angel coming down, telling you, "Hey, Paul's right." That's not necessarily going to convince you any more than what you're doing now, which is legitimate research and questioning, which is awesome. But at the end of the day, too, there has to be some standard as far as like if I can get to this point, if I can have a reasonable amount of confidence, how much do I need in order to take a step of faith? Not to fully engage with the religion, but just to take the first step of faith, whatever that is for you. And that could be something very small. But at the same time, if this is just an intellectual exercise, I mean, but whether it is or not, you have to have some sort of objective measurement in place. Otherwise, the problem that you run into is that what you said before we started, it's an endless hall of mirrors. Like you can get into this, and people spend their whole lives in it, and it doesn't necessarily bear fruit. The fruit that it bears is whether or not it'll. This is I heard somebody say that true theology should always lead you to an experience of God. So if the study is not in the interest of arriving at truth and having a encounter with God, and if this is true, then that's exactly what you want you to do, right? And if it's not true, then there's ways to test that.
Right. And that's
But
why I think doing
beyond,
something
yeah,
like this is useful.
I
So,
think so too.
all right, I'm going to give you
Do it.
a really challenging one. So
Oh,
I
let me
think
get comfy.
this one, if I think it's best if you go to First Corinthians 5:6. Actually, I'm going to ask you if you can see where the Gospels are pulling this from. Maybe I'll ask you that just to see if you kind of see where they're pulling this from Paul. If you're following
Well,
my,
I would still disagree with the statement that they're
you
pulling
might,
from
but I
Paul,
think you're going to
but
see this as
I could
a
agree that
little
there's a
bit more challenging in this case.
I mean, I can see that there's a parallel between one of Jesus's or several of Jesus's teachings, but again, that doesn't mean that it came from Paul. But sure, but go ahead, yeah.
Okay. Are you on it? Five?
First Corinthians 5:6.
Yep.
Your
Okay.
boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough?
Right. Clean
Which
out the old yeast that you may be a new batch as you really are unleavened. So
Uh-huh.
think about the Gospels. Where do we hear things about yeast and leaven and
So it's the
do
point
you
that Paul is
recall?
making. It goes back to Exodus, which I mentioned earlier, that the Passover was pointing to Christ.
Now, there's a more direct connection. Think about the Gospels. It has to do with the Pharisees.
But Jesus is no. Paul is referencing the Old Testament to explain who Jesus is. He's explaining that this is the God that saves you from Exodus or from Egypt. Excuse me.
Yeah, I'm
He's saying
not sure.
this
I
is the
think
pa- this
you're
this is the no. That's the argument that Paul is making. He's reasoning from the scriptures that Jesus is the
right,
Christ.
but all I'm trying to show is where are the Gospels pulling this? Why are they
They're
making
not.
and putting in Jesus's mouth about yeast and
That's an assumption that
disconnection?
you're that's a leap in logic that you're saying that they put them in Jesus's mouth. Like just because Jesus talked about yeast in a certain context, what Paul is saying, let me read it. Get rid of the old yeast that you may be a new unleavened batch as you really are, for Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Yes, obviously he's talking about
Ooh, there's
the yeast.
another one too.
He's
That's
talking
the
about the yeast.
first reference to that as well.
He's talking about the yeast of the Pharisees, yes, but he's using that to
Yes.
tie together. He's tying together that this is the God that saves you from Egypt because he is the sacrificial lamb.
So where do you think the Gospels got this idea of using yeast as a
That's
comparison to that yeast can be spoiled, right?
what we haven't established that the Gospels are taking from Paul, though. That's why I wanted to spend so much time.
Well, I've showed you other examples. We
You
may
show me
yet find
connection,
another direct connection.
but
You can
connection
say
doesn't
they're
mean that it's a
pulling this one
presupposition.
from the Old Testament, but it would be
He
very easy to simply read Paul and use this idea in the context of the Gospels. But that's another example. But you just hit upon another one.
so Acts
This is the
17, 2
first
through
time
3,
that I know that
as
Christ
so
is
hold on.
referred to as a Paschal Lamb.
Right, hold on just a second. So Acts 17, 2 through 3, as was his custom, Paul went to the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah. So it's not inconsistent with that statement. And we're gonna have this will probably be the last point. My computer's getting ready to die. But this is not inconsistent with what Luke is saying Paul does, which is reasons for the divinity for the for who Christ is based off of the Old Testament. That's what he's doing here.
So let me ask you just this
Sure.
point blank.
Yeah.
So are you saying you think it's highly unlikely that the Gospels are using that comparison and putting in the mouth of Jesus something that's clearly talked about by Paul?
I'm not saying that Paul isn't using something that Jesus is talking about and relating it to the Old
You would
Testament.
say it's the opposite, that
I am no, I'm
someone
point blank saying they
reported
should
to
be putting both,
Paul that Jesus made a comparison to the Pharisees of being like,
which he
beware
would
of the Pharisees, right?
which he would know about because he was in fellowship with the
Okay.
other
So you're
apostles.
saying then he's just using this verse about, because this is in a completely different context. So it just kind of was
I don't
on
think
his mind to
I
talk
think
about.
for Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed is the context of the Old Testament
All
because
right. Can
that
I
is
leave you with
Exodus.
one more?
One, yeah, I think
Okay.
yeah.
Here's another one, in the Gospels. So if you look up, it's easier to see it in the God. Look up Mark 12:24.
Gotcha. Are you not in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God?
Okay. And then actually a better, like more direct so you can see it. Look up Mark 9:1 too, so you can see both of them.
Well, let's look at the context real quick. Let's see what he's talking about.
Yeah, I will. I
Talk
just
about
want you to see
marriage.
both examples
What
in
was the
Mark.
other one? You said 9:12,
Mark 9:1.
9:1. And he said to them, truly, I tell you, some of you who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God that has come with power.
Okay. So the key is the kingdom coming in power or the gospel. So if you go to First Corinthians 4:20, Again, we find that echoed in Paul.
which we should because he's preaching the same gospel as Jesus and the apostles. Which actually, so that's actually a great verse to bring up, 1 Corinthians 4:20. So Paul himself makes the point that his mission, I forget the exact verse, but he talks about how I didn't want to come to you with the most persuasive and charismatic and moving speech. I didn't want it to be sophisticated. I wanted it to be Christ and Him crucified, which is the core of our message, which is the power of it, and to rely on demonstrations of the Holy Spirit's power. So that goes back to what I was saying earlier. Why did this message have such a dramatic impact? And part of that is the power, or all of it is the power of the Holy Spirit. And a lot of that is attested to by the miracles that were performed by Paul and the other apostles.
Right. So your argument then is that Paul gets this directly from the risen Jesus.
What do you mean?
So your argument is that it was first said by Jesus in a historical context, and then it gets back to Paul through revelation, and then he talks about for the kingdom of God depends not on talk but on power.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. Yeah. Unless there's a trap in there somewhere that I didn't see.
No, no, it's so you're saying it's
Yeah,
again
I'm saying Jesus said it, and then later down the road, the apostles were, had recorded this either orally or maybe they jotted some notes down. I don't know. And Paul received divine revelation, and that there I already explained, my piece about how those two can go together. And so when he refers to quotations of Jesus and sayings of Jesus, and then ties those back to the Old Testament, and then also uses that to address a current issue in the church, that's not inconsistent with what we would expect to find in a church leader.
so that would be the same. The kingdom is not about eating and drinking. You remember the verses about that John the Baptist comes basically, not eating and drinking, and then the Son of Man comes eating and drinking. That's in the Gospels. That's in Matthew 11:19.
I know what you're talking about.
That can
I'm not
be
seeing.
brought back to Paul again as well. He talks again the same type of. You see what I'm saying.
Right, but at the same time, you
So
should see that.
all of this can be easily explained by the gospel writers simply reading Paul's epistles, which
I would no, no, no. I would disagree with that. So
making narratives out of it.
when you're
That's
saying
easily
if you're so
explained
there
by
that's a
that.
different
You don't
argument
need anything
because
more
the
complicated.
no, because the gospels are very, very different. Their focus is very different. Their focus is on the acts of Jesus and the exact sayings of Jesus.
Right.
Paul's
So they're
focus is
using
doctrinal.
Paul's wording, terminology, and they're
That's back
making
no,
narratives out of
that's
it.
that's backwards because you don't establish the story out of the doctrine. You establish the doctrine out of the story.
So again, but what was written first? Paul's writings or the Gospels?
It doesn't matter what was written first, it matters what happened first.
Well, but that has if you're factoring in probability, it's a lot. Again, I understand it's a faith statement, but
Mm-mm, not even a faith statement. If it the again because the people that could contest his point were alive and with him. So if they were drawing, why would somebody who saw Jesus
so
draw from Paul?
that's an interesting because I hear that argument a lot that people like they could contest it. So think about things in our modern age that people, what would even happen if they did contest it? Like people say, well, the Gospels, they have to be true or they have to be historically accurate because the original apostles would have. Who cares? Do you think that literature gets just destroyed or
Have you
because
read much of
somebody
it?
comes and says that's not how it happened? Like,
Have you read much of the early church history or the discourses? Because there's a mountain of right. They were not shy about
oh, I
writing on
know they
specific. Yeah.
destroyed stuff, but
So I
But,
that was
but what I'm saying is those who are in power, if the Gentile Christians who followed Paul's gospel, right? If they were the drivers, the people who wrote the Gospels were obviously not poor peasants who couldn't read and write, right? They were
Well,
able
they
to
were. They
write
used scribes.
Koine Greek. They
Matthew
were
was Matthew
pretty,
was a tax collector. He's educated. Mark was an aide to Peter. Luke was a doctor.
well, again, that's
John
church
John used a scribe.
history. Whoever wrote these knew how to write in Greek, right?
That's
So they obviously were able to write and compose, and these are
a
not
scribe.
just they actually were able to write pretty well. These are like pretty well composed documents. These aren't just composed by
Not
backwater
necessarily.
fishermen.
So Mark is actually a good example of that. Mark had to be edited because there's so many, I forget what the technical term is, but the way he writes is not,
Yeah, it's a little bit more
yeah. It's like when you say and then
oh,
and then and then and then and then every
yeah.
sentence, like a 6 year, like he does that. He does stuff like that a lot.
Oh,
So
they have
he
they
was able
have their
to,
own styles, no doubt.
that's
Like
not a style. That's a, respectfully, that's not a sign of like a high literacy.
no, but he
I do,
was
you know what I
able
mean?
to
Yeah.
write. He was able to, and that's not in that given time period. Being able to read and write is not a small thing. That was
Not
a
necessarily. The
all.
Hebrews, the Torah, Hebrews were taught a little bit. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody knew how to read and write, but it wasn't a thing where the materials were more of an issue. So it was expensive to write. So if you were going to mass produce a gospel, it had better be
That's
important.
just another aspect to it, is that not everyone had the ability to even write down what they were.
Fortunately, it was an oral tradition long before it was written down. So back to my
So,
apostolic
well,
fathers. So, but I got to end it here. I had a great time though. I
yeah,
would I
it's
would I would be willing to do a part two at some point too.
absolutely like
Yeah.
I've got a list of like 40 of them just
Okay.
here.
Well,
And
here, let me end the recording, but I appreciate your time.